In the previous activities, you learned how to declare variables, convert types, and make decisions using if/else conditions. You now know how to write a Python script that reacts differently depending on a value. But what happens when you need to repeat the same action many times? For example, scanning a list of ports, checking multiple IP addresses, or processing lines in a log file. Doing this manually, line by line, would be extremely tedious and error-prone. This is exactly where loops come in. A loop is a programming structure that allows you to repeat a block of instructions automatically, either a fixed number of times or as long as a condition remains true. Python offers two main types of loops, the for loop and the while loop. Understanding both, knowing when to use each, and avoiding common pitfalls are essential skills for any security automation professional. What is a for loop? The for loop is used when you already know, or can determine in advance, the number of repetitions, or when you want to iterate over a collection of elements. In Python, the for loop goes through each element of a sequence one by one and executes the same block of instructions for each element. Here is the basic syntax. For variable and sequence. Instructions to repeat. The word variable is a name you choose. At each iteration of the loop, this variable takes the value of the next element in the sequence. The sequence can be a list, a range of numbers, a string of characters, or any other iterable object. A very common way to use a for loop is with the built-in function range. This function generates a sequence of integers. For example, for I in range 5, print I. This code will display 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 on separate lines. Note that range 5 starts at 0 and stops before 5. This is very important. Python counts from 0 by default. You can also specify a starting point and an endpoint. For I in range 1, 6, print I. This displays 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can even specify a step. For I in range 0, 20, 5, print I. This displays 0, 5, 10, 15. The loop increments by 5 each time. Iterating over a list. In cybersecurity automation, you will frequently work with lists of IP addresses to scan, lists of ports to test, lists of usernames to check. The for loop is perfectly suited for this. Example. Ports equals 22, 80, 443, 8080, 3306 for port in ports. Print checking port. This code goes through the list ports and displays each port number one by one. Notice that the variable port automatically takes each value in turn, 22, then 80, then 443, and so on. Another example with IP addresses. IP_addresses equals 192.168.1.1, 192.168.1.2, 192.168.1.3 for IP and IP_addresses. Print scanning, IP. This is very similar to what a real network scanning script would do. Combining for loops with conditions dash. You already know how to use if/else conditions. You can combine them directly inside a loop. For example, to display only ports below 1024, the reserved ports you already encountered in a previous workshop. Ports equals 22, 80, 443, 8080, 3306, 8443 for port in ports. If port less than 1024, print port is a reserved port, else print port is not a reserved port. This combination of loops and conditions is one of the most powerful and frequently used patterns in Python scripting for security tasks. What is a while loop? The while loop is different from the for loop. Instead of iterating over a sequence, it repeats a block of instructions as long as a condition remains true. You use the while loop when you do not know in advance how many times the loop will run. Here is the basic syntax. While condition. Instructions to repeat. As long as the condition evaluates to true, the loop continues. The moment the condition evaluates to false, the loop stops and the program continues with the next instruction after the loop. Simple example. Counter equals 0. While counter less than 5. Print counter value. Counter. Counter equals counter plus 1. This displays counter value 0, counter value 1, counter value 2, counter value 3, counter value 4. At each iteration, the variable counter is incremented by 1. When counter reaches 5, the condition counter less than 5 becomes false, and the loop stops. The risk of infinite loops. One critical danger with the while loop is the infinite loop. If the condition never becomes false, the loop runs forever and your program freezes. This is a very common beginner mistake. Example of an infinite loop: do not run this as is. Counter equals 0. While counter less than 5. Print counter value. Counter. Hash forgetting to increment counter means the condition never changes. Since counter never changes, the condition counter less than 5 is always true, and the loop never ends. Always make sure that something inside the loop eventually makes the condition false. To stop a running Python script that is stuck in an infinite loop, you can press Ctrl+C in the terminal. The break and continue keywords. Python provides two important keywords to control the behavior of loops: break and continue. The break keyword immediately stops the loop, regardless of whether the condition is still true or whether there are more elements to iterate over. Execution jumps to the first instruction after the loop. Example: ports equals 22, 80, 443, 8080, 3306 for port in ports. If port equals 443, print found port 443, stopping scan. Break. Print checking port. The output will be checking port 22, checking port 80, found port 443, stopping scan. The loop stops as soon as it encounters port 443. Ports 8080 and 3306 are never processed. The continue keyword skips the rest of the current iteration and moves directly to the next one. It does not stop the loop entirely. Example: ports equals 22, 80, 443, 8080, 3306 for port in ports. If port equals 443, continue. Print checking port. The output will be checking port 22, checking port 80, checking port 8080, checking port 3306. Port 443 is skipped, but the loop continues with the remaining ports. Practical example: checking multiple ports with a while loop dash. Here is a more realistic example combining a while loop and a condition. Port equals 1 while port less than equals 1024. If port equals 80, print port 80 detected, HTTP service, elif port equals 22, print port 22 detected, SSH service, port equals port plus 1. This loop checks all ports from 1 to 1024 and displays a message for specific ports of interest. This is a simplified version of what a port scanner does. Indentation, the essential rule in Python. In Python, indentation, the spaces or tabs at the beginning of a line, is not just a style choice, it is mandatory and defines which instructions belong to the loop. Every instruction that must be repeated inside the loop must be indented by one level, conventionally 4 spaces. If you forget the indentation, Python will raise an indentation error and your script will not run. This applies to all code blocks in Python, including loops and conditions. The else clause in loops. Python has a specific feature that many beginners are not aware of. You can attach an else clause to a for or while loop. The else block runs only if the loop completed normally, that is, without being interrupted by a break statement. Example: ports equals 22, 80, 8080 for port in ports. If port equals 443, print port 443 found. Break.else. Print port 443 was not found in the list. Since 443 is not in the list, the loop finishes without break, and the else block executes, displaying port 443 was not found in the list. This pattern is useful when you are searching for something and want to know if the search succeeded or not. Choosing between for and while. Knowing which loop to use is a matter of context. Use a for loop when you have a known sequence to iterate over, a list of ports, a range of numbers, lines in a file, or when the number of repetitions is known in advance. Use a while loop when the number of repetitions depends on a dynamic condition that changes during execution, waiting for user input, retrying a connection until it succeeds, monitoring a value until it reaches a threshold. In cybersecurity scripting, you will very often use for loops to process lists of targets, and while loops to retry operations or wait for certain conditions. Summary of key points. A for loop iterates over a sequence, list, range, string, and repeats a block of code for each element. The range function generates a sequence of integers, starting at 0 by default. A while loop repeats a block of code as long as a condition is true. Always make sure the condition in a while loop eventually becomes false to avoid infinite loops. The break keyword stops the loop immediately. The continue keyword skips the current iteration and moves to the next one. Indentation is mandatory in Python to define the body of a loop. An else clause on a loop runs only if the loop was not interrupted by break. Combine loops with if/else conditions to create powerful automation logic for tasks like port scanning, log analysis, and IP address validation. With these tools, You are now able to write Python scripts that process large amounts of data automatically, which is a fundamental capability for any security automation or DevSecOps workflow.